all the programmes there anyway. So tonight, I'm going to just say something about Robert, because I thought I'd just print off something about his book that he's completed here. And this subject is very, I love this. I've just said to Bob, my first pet as a tiny baby was called Moses. So I love that name, Moses. I think it's an adorable name, and whenever I think about it, I always think I'm loving this black kitten, no, how silly is that? But it's just so nice. So now it says here that Robert is a metallurgist, and he's a journalist and a scholar of world religions, which of course is so interesting. And he has written numerous books and participated in many television documentaries on the subject of religion and the Middle East. And his explorations in the Sinai desert, wow, have identified the first solid evidence of the Exodus and the place of the giving of the Ten Commandments. And here's the book, here they are, on the table here. So, I'll put this here as well. This is obviously about the book. So I'm not going to talk any more. May I introduce Robert? Bob?
Robert
Fibber.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lorna, and it's a great pleasure to be here in Dorset. And I've got a mystery for you that I hope I will offer an explanation that clears up some of the mysteries. Just to give you a bit of background, we're coming out of Egypt with Moses across the Sinai desert towards the Promised Land. But before we do that, we need to get into Egypt with the Canaanites. Mainly when they get to Egypt, they become a group, probably a mixed group, because the Bible talks about a mixed group coming out of Egypt, and some of them are Israelites. But getting into Egypt is what triggered my whole sort of interest in this area, and that started with my interest in the copper scroll. I'm a metallurgist by training, and quite accidentally I heard that one of the Dead Sea Scrolls was engraved on copper, and it turned out to be highly pure copper, about 99.9% pure. And that really struck me as incredibly strange. Why were people engraving on highly pure copper at the time of Jesus, that sort of period, the Second Temple period, around about 2,000 years ago? And I started researching and studying, and then I realized that a lot of the conceptions about this copper scroll, which was found at Qumran by the Dead Sea, in the possession originally of a very mysterious celibate group who lived, worshipped, prayed, and looked after and wrote some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they inscribed on one scroll what turned out to be a list of 64 places where treasure was buried. And within the text of the inscription on the copper plate was the name in Greek, there were 14 Greek letters scattered amongst them, mainly an ancient form of Hebrew. And no one knew quite what, they were a mystery, these 14 Greek letters. And I came along and I looked at them, and I put the first 10 letters together, and they read Akhenaton. And I wasn't too sure what that was at the time, so I consulted some experts, Professor John Tate at University College London, Professor Rosalie David, and they told me it sounds like it's Akhenaton. And I thought, what on earth is an Egyptian pharaoh's name doing in a Jewish scroll of the Second Temple period? And in addition to that, within the scroll, there's what the scroll must have looked like when it was first engraved. Beautifully polished copper, which is very expensive at that time. So they were putting their message onto something which they clearly valued enormously. And it turned out to be, as I said, a list of 64 places where treasure is buried. And this is a transliteration from one of the columns in the scroll. And you've got a Hebrew kaf, double kaf, and then this sort of upturned hill and two straight lines. And that's read as 22. 22 talents. This 10, 10, 20, 22. And it's clear that within this Hebrew document they were using Egyptian numbering. And no one quite knew why or what or how. And they were taking this talent, which is normally approximately about 72 pounds, or 35 kilograms, which gave them a huge quantity of treasure, something like 25 tons of gold and 65 tons of silver. Quite absurd tons. And this is the official translations, which you can see, you can still see. I thought this is just not right. As a metallurgist, I knew you didn't talk about gold and silver in kilograms. You talked about in ounces, fractions of a gram. So I thought, you've got the name of an Egyptian pharaoh, you've got Egyptian style of numbering, and you've got two cuffs which they read as a biblical talent. I said, well, hang on, let's have a look and see what the equivalent Egyptian weight term is. And it turns out to be that there was an equivalent value which was only applied to precious metals in Egypt. And that means that this is not a talent. It's a value of more like about 10.2 grams. And when you use that weight instead of 35 kilograms, you come up with a much more realistic value of the treasures listed in the scroll. So this took me to Egypt. And we came from here, which is by the Dead Sea in Israel, across to Akhenaton, or Akhenaton, which is a name that Pharaoh Akhenaton gave to his capital city, which he built a brand new city in the middle of Egypt, halfway up the Nile between Cairo and Thebes. And he instigated a brand new religion, the first form of monotheism in history. And the idea that all the Egyptian religion was pagan and idolatrous is basically true, but there was a period of about 17 years when they had a quite pure form of monotheism being advocated by this revolutionary pharaoh, Akhenaton. And I believe that Jacob and Joseph were there at the same time, and together they propounded this new form of a religion, believing in only one invisible almighty God. And Akhenaton called the name of his God, he called him the Aton, Akhenaton. And in Egyptian, you can transliterate the D and the T. So if you take the T and turn it into a D, you get Adon as his name for God. And that is the Hebrew name for God, Adonai. So there's a lineage you can trace all the way down. So that took me to Egypt. This is an image of Akhenaton and Nefertiti. And what he was proposing was a new form of religion, not just a new form of religion, but a new philosophy of emancipation for women, to be equal with men, to spread the wealth of the country to everybody and make worship open to everybody. We won't have too much time but this again took me to Egypt. And I went to Amarna, and I went for another reason too, because my next type of research after the Copper Scroll, which had taken me to Egypt, was to see whether the people at Qumran had any influence on Christianity and the New Testament. They're generally referred to as Essenes. That was a label put on them by Roman and Greek historians, particularly Josephus. But they didn't call themselves Essenes. They called themselves the scribes, the Yahad, the devout, the Herodians, eunuchs, in the sense that they were celibate. At the Qumran community, there was about 200 of them at any one time, and they were only male only. There's some contention about that, but basically. So I went to Amarna to look and follow this thread, because I'd come to the conclusion that not only was Jesus a member of this community, that John the Baptist was a member of that community, and that John the Baptist was buried there. In fact, I know exactly where he was buried, at Qumran by the Dead Sea, and that Jesus was also a member until the age of 30, and that he's buried somewhere near there. I probably know the place, but I'm not going to specify it for obvious reasons. Jesus was a member there from probably some time after the age of 12 to 30, when that was the first opportunity you could graduate as a full member of this community. There's about 200 people at any one time, between about 130 BC to 68 CE. We know the dates pretty precisely. So Jesus is there learning, and it's not, I think, a coincidence that the earliest age at which you could graduate as a full member of this Qumran community, that's Yahad, was 30. You had to go through a process of initiation and stages, 3 stages, rather similar to the degrees of the Masonic movement before you became a full brother at the age of 30. And it's not a coincidence that the New Testament says Jesus comes out and starts his ministry at the age of 30. Exactly the same age. From the age of 12 to 30, we know nothing about Jesus. They're the so-called lost years, which is absurd. How can someone who's going to found the most prolific religion in the world be absolutely silent for 18 years of his life? But I think he's ensconced at this community that we saw at Qumran for 18 years. And that's where he got his knowledge, his huge knowledge, because this devout community were very learned, studying all the time, studying, you can't call them biblical texts because the Bible hasn't been really confirmed at that stage, but they had their own versions of holy texts. They had their own sectarian texts, and they had things like the Copper Scroll, which are an apocryphal and pseudepigraphic material. And Jesus became extremely learned in these. This is why it became pretty obvious from very early on when I started looking at the subject that some of the material in the Dead Sea Scrolls had transferred over into the New Testament. And that can only have happened, especially as some of the documents were highly secretive, even written in code. They had been taken over and reproduced in the New Testament. So there must have been someone there with knowledge, like Jesus or John the Baptist, who passed that knowledge on to the writers who eventually wrote the New Testament down. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and of course Paul. So this took me to Egypt, and in the tomb of Pen-Hazy, I saw this incredible image, which is, it's a relief. Remember, we are talking of something which is 3,300 years old. The reign of Akhenaton is about 1350 BC. And that is amazing that the colours are still there, and the image, and what it is a picture, it's not easy to see, but this is a picture of Akhenaton, and beside him is Nefertiti, his wife. And this is not too easy to see, but in an enlarged version, you will find that here, Nefertiti is holding in her arms a baby with a halo about its head. So what I think has happened here, very early followers of Jesus have found their way back to the source of their religion, to Amarna, to Akhenaton's holy city in central Egypt. And they've come into this cave and they've seen a picture of Akhenaton, which they knew about through the Dead Sea Scroll material that Jesus and his followers were aware of. And they drew an image, they put the Chi-Rho, which was a very early form of Christianity, a sign of Christianity, across the relief of Akhenaton and Nefertiti, and they put a picture of Jesus with a halo in his head, around his head, in the arms of Nefertiti. So this is another reason why I've been drawn to Egypt, in the sense, for a lot of the answers to many of the mysteries that dog religion and misunderstanding of the origins of Judaism and Christianity. They all stem from Akhenaton and Amarna. So we've got into Egypt. A very brief introduction of how we wanted to get into Egypt. So the Israelites, or the Canaanites, with Joseph, who's vizier to Akhenaton, he brings his family over, Jacob, and all the other brothers and sons of Jacob. Joseph marries an Egyptian, has 2 sons, and they then become the tribe of Israel. Akhenaton is he's not despised. Later in history, he's despised by the pagan priests who get back into power. They have been stripped of all their authority by Akhenaton, who's tried to get rid of all the idols and pagan images across Egypt. So for 17 years he manages to do that, and they are languishing away out of power and out of wealth and out of control. When Akhenaton disappears, probably murdered, they get back into power. The priests of Amun and Khons and Ra take power back. They destroy his city, beautiful golden virgin white city in the middle of Egypt, and they bring the capital back to Thebes. And obviously his followers, Joseph and the family that Jacob brought with him into Egypt, are then persona non grata. They're out of favour, and they are put to servitude, probably. And this is the beginning of the Hebrews in slavery in Egypt. They no longer have their mentor, Akhenaton, to protect them, and they are taken into service. So now we're about 1350 BCE, 60 or 70 years later. Joseph is gone, but Moses is born in the time of Ramses II, maybe about 1280, something like that. 1350, 1280, about 70 years later, something like that. Moses arrives, and he's educated at Heliopolis, which is we've moved on. A traditional place for Akhenaton's early establishment of his religion, but that's all been destroyed. But nevertheless, the idea of one God that Akhenaton enunciated, together with Jacob and Joseph, has not disappeared. It's gone underground. Moses comes across the ideas of this religion, and he likes it. And that's why I think he becomes a renegade at the court of Pharaoh. He's a prince of Egypt, and a very powerful person in his own right, very wealthy. And he finds these people, these Hebrews, also believing in one God. How can that be? They've still kept the belief in one God that they learnt at Amarna, Akhenaton's capital city. So he says, these people believe in what I believe. They believe in one God. They realize that all these wooden and stone idols are man-made and don't really mean anything. But an invisible, all-powerful, spiritual God is what I believe in, and they seem to believe in the same people. So what happens? The natural thing happens. He adopts them as his people. He says, these are my people. They believe in the God, the Aton, the Adon, and I believe in them. They are going to be my people. He adopts them, and now we've got to get them out of Egypt. So he ransoms them. In fact, the Bible actually says he ransoms them. He pays for their release from servitude in Egypt. And that explains so many things about the early history of the Bible, which I believe fundamentally an awful lot of it is based on fact. An awful lot of it is glamorized and glorified and made up. But there are some firm facts that we're going to look at and we'll see. And the Exodus is one of them. So let's start on the Exodus. Moses is now leading his new followers, his newfound flock, if you like, out of Egypt. And, whoops, I'll learn how to use this in a minute. They're starting around here, around a place called Ramses. And that is the allusion to Pharaoh Ramses, his capital, and where they were based in the Delta region, where they'd been put to work, building palaces and temples for the Pharaoh. And around about 1250, 1240, that sort of period, Moses leads them out, and I believe this dotted line, red dotted line, is my version of the route that they took out of Egypt. And here, and then up through what is now Jordan, the Arabah, around and to Mount Nebo, and then across into Canaan. Now that red dotted line is not, I wouldn't claim that that's absolutely accurate. It's my version of it. I think that one thing is quite certain. This place here, St. Catherine's Mount, which is traditionally a place of pilgrimage for people to go and to Mount Sinai, where they think the Ten Commandments were received, but that is almost highly unlikely. The only reason that St. Catherine's Monastery, has anyone been to St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, southern Sinai? It's a beautiful place, well worth a visit, but it's got nothing to do with the Ten Commandments. It's simply a place that Helena, Emperor Constantine's mother, designated as the place where the burning bush was, where Jesus had his transfiguration, and where the Ten Commandments were received. And it's the most popular tourist site for this particular legend, but it's the wrong place. She got Christianity, she kind of inculcated Christianity onto Emperor Constantine, although it's not clear that he took to it until very late in his life. So I don't think St. Catherine's comes into the frame. But what I do suggest is that the beginning of the Exodus is pretty sure. What the exact route was, I don't know exactly. I wouldn't be presumptuous to say. Probably they went through Kadesh Barnea because it was a well-known oasis where there was sufficient water to sustain a large population in transit from Egypt to the Promised Land. And maybe they wandered around here, but they almost certainly came through the Arabah, this area here where there was a copper mining area. And all the different routes that people propose for the Exodus, they virtually all have those 3 points in common. They all start here, they all probably go through there, and they probably come through here, and they go up around the rest of the route. There's all sorts of permutations that dozens of people have put forward. So we've now arrived here. And if I press the right button, we can move on. A lot of people don't believe very much about the Bible. The so-called minimalists who doubt there was an Exodus, they doubt that Moses existed. They don't think there was much reality in the Bible that we have today that was written down much before the 8th century BC. And they cite the reasons for not believing in the Exodus and Moses is that it talks about 605,000 people coming out of Egypt. And they say it's impossible for the desert to sustain such large numbers for 40 years, as the Bible claims. They say there's a lack of any archaeological remains in the Sinai for this transition across the desert. No evidence of Hebrews in Egypt or Sinai or Canaan for the period. All those doubts are implausible and wrong. And they're wrong because, first of all, 605 males would have equated to 2.5 million people with wives and children. The population in Egypt at that period is estimated to be in about 3 million. So clearly 2.5 million people coming out can't be right. And the reason is they've mistranslated this term and used an elef as 1,000 too much. And it should be something like 1/10 of that. So we're talking about 50 to 60,000 people coming out, not 605,000, which means the likelihood of them being sustained in the desert is much more feasible. And the desert of Sinai, before 1200 BC, was much more fertile than it is now, or was after 1200 BC. At that period, there was a sudden change in the climate and droughts and set in across the large parts of the Middle East. So the Sinai would have been much more likely to be able to sustain not 605,000, maybe 40, 30, 30,000 people, perhaps that sort of number. So that becomes a skepticism you can strike out. Lack of any archaeological remains in Sinai is frequently cited, but that's nonsense. There's vast amounts of archaeological remains in the Sinai of people coming through and encamped. And we'll see some of those later. And no evidence of Hebrews in Egypt or the Sinai or Canaan. Wrong again, wrong, wrong, wrong. There's very firm evidence from people like Manfred Beitak and Hofmeier, who've done excavation work in the Delta region and shown that there was certainly people who were almost certainly the Hebrews in Egypt prior to the Exodus. And what I will show in the middle period, this evidence of them in Sinai will strike out that objection. In terms of coming into the promised land, no archaeological evidence. That again is completely wrong. There is evidence of an influx of something like 60 to 70,000 people round about 1200 BC into Canaan, mainly in the hill country. And we know that they are newcomers. They're not Canaanites who suddenly turned and become Israelites, which some scholars seem to suggest as a possibility. Well, that's unlikely because there are markers for these new settlements on the hill, in the hill country, with a kind of style of house which is unique to this group, that's just this new incoming group. They use terracing, a form of terracing for farming, which is actually the same as the style that they learnt in Egypt. The houses that they build are the designs that are seen in the area of Ramses in Egypt, quite unique to that area and unique to Canaan. There's no evidence of any pigs or pork in their diet. Again, a marker for Israelites. So we do have evidence in Canaan of a new influx of people. So that, again, if we can strike that one out. The middle one, evidence in the Sinai, we'll come to in great detail, because that's really. This is a picture of St. Catherine's Monastery in southern Sinai. If you get a chance, it's worth going to. But the mountain there is 7,500 feet high. The mountain that's thought to be the mountain that Moses climbs. Moses, according to the Bible, and we have to take a lot of this with a bit of a pinch of salt and a pile of sand, if you like, because it's glorified, exaggerated, and not exact. But the core of it is true. And he's highly unlikely to have been able to climb up this 7,500 foot mountain, come down with tablets, go up again and come down again. Poor chap's supposed to be about 80. It's unlikely. Another reason it just doesn't work. So what happens when the Israelites flee? I don't know if any of you have seen the recent Ridley Scott film, Exodus, Gods and Kings, with Christian Bale as Moses. And he has Moses as a brother of Ramses II. Well, it's a possibility, but highly unlikely. And we know that Ramses was ruling at the period of the beginning of the Exodus, but I do not think that he is the Pharaoh of the pursuit. And this is one of the main reasons. We have the mummy of Merneptah, who was Ramses' son, who took over when Ramses II dies. And I think he is the Pharaoh of the pursuit. And this is weird. His mummy is in the Cairo Museum. There's the mummy of Ramses II, discovered at Deir al-Bahariya in 1881. Black, very dark brown. In fact, most of the mummies you see in any museum have got very dark stained surfaces. But when we come to the mummy of Merneptah, who I believe was the pharaoh who pursues the Israelites out of Egypt, and probably drowns, just as the Bible says, he's mummified with a different kind of salt, not the normal natron, which they got from the Valley of Natron for their conventional form of mummification, but they must have had to do it very rapidly because of heat and the decay of the body, and they mummified him with a form of salt which is local to the marshy district near to the Delta region. So it may well be the Bible gets it right when it says that Pharaoh's chariots came to a sticky end and they all get killed and drowned. And recent biological and pathological examination of Merneptah's torso has shown that he almost certainly, that there was briny water in his lungs and he almost certainly died from drowning. So that confirms some of the detail that the Bible records in Exodus. And it's very unusual for a pharaoh to die in office, almost unheard of. But Merneptah definitely dies in office. And he leaves behind him a victory stela, dated very accurately to 1207 BC. And this is his huge black monolithic stela, which is in the Cairo Museum, and it records records of his battles and his victories. And the hieroglyphics read that he fought battles against Ashkelon, Gaza, and Yanoram. But when it comes to talking about his battles against this people here, we find something very strange. The determinative for this hieroglyphic word here is a woman and a man, which indicates that there are a people. The next thing that's going to follow this sort of determinative is a people. And it reads in hieroglyphics, Yisrael. It's the first mention in history of Israel. And what Merneptah's stela is telling us is that he's vanquished a people who are in transit. They're not in a fixed position. They are a people on the move. And this almost certainly confirms what the Bible says, that Merneptah pursues a people who are fleeing. When the stela is talking about Ashkelon, Gaza, and Yanoram, the determinative is a circle with a cross in it, which means a place. It's a fixed place, and that is a repeated designation for a location in hieroglyphics. So he's talking about three places, but a third group who are in transit, who are not a fixed place. They're probably almost certainly Yisrael, the Israelites, fleeing from Egypt. So how do we know much about what was going on in Egypt, in Sinai? I said to you that the minimalists, the people who doubt the validity of the Bible, don't think there's any archaeological evidence in Sinai at all of the Hebrews, but there is a huge amount. And the Merneptah stela is a clear example of a people in Israel. Where the minimalists are probably almost certainly correct, they say that the period of the kings, King Saul, King David, King Solomon, in the around about 1000 BC down to about 930 BC, 40 BC, says there's no evidence for them. And they appear to be right. There's no archaeological evidence virtually whatsoever of those three kings, of King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. We've found nothing that can confirm all the stories in the Bible about their vast palaces and huge kingdom and the building of the first temple. That's another issue. But so that is almost certainly glorification and an embellishment of a much more minimalistic fact of chieftains in Canaan who have come in. So, but they say because of that, there's nothing before the monarchy, the so-called period of the monarchs, is true either. But that's nonsense. Just because we've got a gap in our confirmed knowledge doesn't mean that anything before is not true. And I'm absolutely sure that the Exodus and Moses before the monarchy period, before the Israelites come into Israel to Canaan, the Promised Land, and there's a period of Judges, and then the monarchy period, and then in the so-called divided period, we have lots of archaeological evidence for the subsequent kings after King Solomon. That is pretty accepted by most scholars. The period of the kings, the monarchy, is probably very doubtful, the reality of it, certainly in the detail in the Bible. But the detail before of the Exodus and Moses is fundamentally, in my view, correct. And the fact we've got a gap in our knowledge doesn't invalidate it at all. So the person who did most of the excavation work, and when I've argued with people and discussed with people, say, well, where's your evidence? This man is the evidence. This is a chap called Benno Rothenberg, and I got interested in him because he was one of the first archaeometallurgists to study the history and archaeology of metals. And he excavated in the Sinai, that was his speciality, between 1959 and 1970, and he carried on writing about his work and recording, and he documented inscriptions and campsites and archaeological remains across the whole of Sinai. And what he concluded was there were at least two places, Sarabat al-Kadam, where the Egyptians were traditionally mining turquoise in Sinai, and a place called Timna, where it's a copper mine, where they were mining copper. And they'd been mining copper since about 3,500 BC. And they carried on mining there until around just before 1200 BC. Then something dramatic happened. And Benno Rothenberg described all the activities of these campsites that the Egyptians were occupying. And they were occupying campsites with thousands of people doing the work of these mining operations. So the idea that the desert could not sustain a large population is frankly nonsense. This is proven by the work of Benno Rothenberg, which most scholars don't seem to be aware of, let alone take account of. So something dramatic happens that stops them staying there. The Hittites in Anatolia, northern Mesopotamian Turkey, what is now Turkey, rose as a power in the district, and they threatened. Excuse me. It happens when I talk too much. I often talk too much. The Hittites become the next power in the region, and the Egyptians have a huge encounter with the Hittites, a battle at Kadesh, when they clearly get a bloody nose. Although their records, which invariably never talk about a defeat, talk about a victory. But we get a different story from the record, the inscriptional record about the Hittites. It was almost a standoff. If anything, the Hittites won. And they drove the Egyptians back, and the Egyptians started to retreat from their traditional colonies right across the Middle East, which they had dominated for several thousand years. Now they're retreating, and they're retreating out of Canaan, and they're retreating out of the Sinai. So what's going to happen? The mines that they'd occupied, and they brought in Midianites and Amalekites to help them do the mining, they are left vacant. The Egyptians retreat back to the borders of Egypt. There is now a vacuum in the Sinai around about 1220, 1230. Ideal opportunity for the Israelites to come through the Sinai. And what better place to settle than a campsite that's been populated and can sustain a large population for many, many years than Sarabat al-Kadem or Timna in the Arabah. And that, I think, is what happens. When the Egyptians leave, the Midianites, who've been there doing the work of the mining, take control of the area. But not for long, because the Israelites arrive. And this is fascinating. And this is where we see hard, concrete, artifactual evidence of what the Bible says, confirming its essential validity and truth. The Midianites worship a copper snake. How weird. Well, they're mining copper, that's their metal. They're experts in metallurgy. there's a group of the Midianites called the Kenites, who are even more expert in metallurgy, and they must have fashioned this copper snake. And if you read the Bible in Exodus, you'll see that Moses supposedly fashions a copper snake and mounts it on a pole to ward off serpents that are molesting the Israelites and his followers. And this is almost certainly that copper snake, which was found by Rothenberg at the mountain that I suggest is the correct mountain where the Ten Commandments were received. And it's not just this particular piece of evidence, there's a whole tranche of evidence which confirms what the Bible in quite stark detail is telling us about the place where the Ten Commandments were received. So the Israelites arrive, the Midianites are there, worshipping their copper snake. There may have been friendly relations initially between the Israelites and the Midianites. In fact, the Bible kind of alludes to it because Moses is supposed to have taken Zipporah, a Midianite, as a wife. So there was good relations. And Raguel, her father, is apparently a Midianite priest who becomes a confidant of Moses. That's all in the Bible. Makes sense that there was a sort of a rapprochement between them. But then it looks like the Israelites kicked out the Midianites and took control of what had previously been an Egyptian place of worship or mining, then became a Midianite place, and then becomes an Israelite place. So, when we get to the story in the Bible of worshipping of the golden calf, what's that all about? Well, this is a traditional god Hathor that the Egyptians worshipped, a goddess of merriment and dancing and frivolity. Just as the Bible says, when Aaron fashioned a golden calf for the people, reluctantly, they dance and sing and make merry around this calf while Moses is up the mountain collecting the Ten Commandments. Everything fits very, very well. And this calf is what the Egyptians were worshipping at this mountain until they leave because of the problems with the Hittites. This is the shrine. This is the holy shrine at the base of the mountain that the Egyptians erected, built for their god Es, female cow god, the golden calf. They built this shrine here. And I don't know if any of you can remember the detail of the Exodus, but it talks about standing stones in the shrine that Moses erects. It talks about libation basins in the shrine that Moses erects at the base of the mountain. And this is at the base of the mountain that I suggest is the exact and correct Mount Sinai. And they have an altar here of worship. And we'll come back to that because I've measured these by hand with a metric tape measure. I've measured the dimensions, exact dimensions of this shrine area and the altar area. And at the back here, I don't know if you can see it, not so easily, maybe next in the next illustration, there is a niche. And in that niche, they must have had an image of Hathor, the goddess that they worshipped, the Egyptian goddess they worshipped. So what happens? The Midianites take over because the Egyptians have disappeared and gone back to their borders. Midianites put a copper snake in this niche, which they worship. When Rothenberg gets there, he finds that it's empty. That again makes absolute sense because when the Israelites take over and evict the Midianites, they don't have any image to put in their holy of holy niche. It's an invisible God, so they leave it empty. Makes absolute sense. But Rothenberg, the archaeologist, finds a copper snake in the debris around the back of, and he finds also a statue of Hathor, the Egyptian goddess, that has been defaced round the back of the shrine. Absolutely fits exactly as the Bible describes. And the sequence of events makes absolute logic. So I measure this. It's a bit crude, my measurements. I'm in the desert, there's wind blowing around, it's very hot. It's a vast open plain in front of this mountain, which is just what you envisage for a large number of Israelites, and not just Israelites, because there are clearly others, people with them, priests and Egyptians, and maybe some Nubians. It's a mixed company, and they're referred to as a mixed company, armed, that come out of Egypt. And it's not surprising, because Moses is a prince in his own right, and a leader, a general, a military person with his own chariot group. So I measure the altar that we saw, and I find that from the curtain sizes given in Exodus, we have, in Exodus 32, an area for the shrine of 32 foot 6 inches by 30 foot. Why am I talking about curtaining? Because the Bible talks about a tabernacle being built over this shrine with curtains. And it describes the curtaining as being fine linen, red and yellow. Remember that, because that's so highly significant in the next image we see. So the size given in the Bible for the shrine matches almost exactly. I measured it as 34 foot 9 inches by 29 foot 6, and it actually, in biblical terms, is 32 foot 6 inches by 30 foot. We're talking about 3,200 years ago, and yet the Bible has the measurements pretty accurately to what they are now today, on site, in the Arabah of the Sinai desert. Cannot be a coincidence. The altar size, which is described made of shittim wood. Shittim is acacia. That's the Hebrew word for acacia, which is a common form of shrub with wooden bush that they would have made the altar out of. Absolutely consistent with what's found on the ground. And the Bible in Exodus 27:1 says that the altar was 5 cubits long by 5 cubits broad. Cubit is a bit of a variable size, but it's effectively the distance from your fingertip to your elbow. And I take it as about 53 centimeters. And at that rate, you find that the altar comes out, in biblical terms, as 2.65 meters by 2.65 meters, about 8'7" by 8'7". And the altar itself is not far off that measurement. It's 7.4 by 9.4. Okay, it's not exactly accurate, but it's near enough for them to have known pretty well the rough size of that altar in the desert. But there's more. I did this in 2008. I've been looking and exploring in the Sinai for a period of 4 to 5 years, and stumbled across this mountain almost accidentally, and then started to see that so many things, characteristics of it, fitted the biblical description. One of the descriptions in the Bible is that this is a place of smoke and thunder, and that the Israelites were led in the desert by a column of smoke and fire. Well, what's that all about? That's all about the fact that here was copper smelting going on, and in the night you would see the columns from the fires and smelting of the copper going up into the sky with red and sparks and smoke, exactly as the Bible describes. It makes sense that this was the place, a copper smelting industrial area that they saw in the distance before they came to it, just as the Bible describes. But this is the defaced statue of Hathor that Benno Rothenberg found. You can see it had a distinctive, characteristic cow-shaped face, and it's been, am I being waved at yet, Lorna?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, by the way, if anyone wants to ask a question while I'm talking desperately, you can pop it. Yes,
Lorna. I do ask a question, Robert. I'm not veering off slightly here, but when you're talking about all these numbers, I've got this inkling about things about the Bible actually has got 2 layers of knowledge. But we've got the sentences that the common man can read, eventually when he could read after translation. and the original measurements of things, it could be another knowledge altogether on another plane. Do you think, though, that the numbers, the geometry of this has got any meaning, or do you think it's just plain, flat, everyday stuff?
I think we can take these numbers literally for what they were, that these are a memory of the period in the desert that the Israelites brought into Canaan and eventually wrote, probably verbally and orally, handed down from mouth to mouth through families. But if there's several thousand people there, a lot of them would have remembered the detail. So it comes down to be written maybe in the 7th or 8th century BC, but the memories is, I think, pretty well accurate. And it's amazingly how accurate it is in view of the time passage. So I think you can take the numbers pretty literally. And defacing the goddess, well, they would have done that. This is an idol. They are now worshipping an invisible god, so they can't have this. They destroy it. This is looking into the naos, the niche areas, where they're probably there. But I'm not sure if it's this one or this one, actually. But there would have been a statue initially of the cow goddess Hathor in that niche in front of the altar, behind the altar, on the side of the mountain, just as the Bible talks about this altar being placed at the foot of a mountain. And it would have been there. That would have been removed by the Midianites. They would have put their copper snake in there. The Israelites come along. Oh, can't have that. It's an idol, another idol. Throw it out, leave it empty, an invisible, empty nails.
Oh.
Yes?
It looks like there's a face there.
That's amazing. Someone else
Yeah.
pointed that. I think it was maybe you. That middle one gets the pointer.
If you look, there's the eye, top of the head and nose down there. It's almost like sharp, vaguely bird-like, and I think some of it is shadow.
You may well be right. I've not noticed that before until you
Also,
pointed
it's
it out.
facing the altar stone there.
It does, doesn't it? But it makes sense that they would have put a carving in as well as the statue. 10 minutes, thank you, Lord. As well as the statue of Hathor, they may well have put a carving, and they did another carving too, which you're going to see, which confirms what you're saying, Dave, about the actual intention to highlight an Egyptian goddess at this place, goddess of this particular mining activity. Above the altar, high up on the side of the cliff, is a flat-ish sloping platform where I believe Moses must have stood and either wrote down or composed or was given the Ten Commandments. The acoustics are weird there. If you ever go to this place, when I was there, someone was up on this platform with some tourists, and he was speaking in not a loud voice, and I was 100 meters away in the desert, and I could hear everything distinctly. The acoustics are quite astounding. And above the altar, the Egyptians had carved a relief of Ramses III here, and this is the goddess Hathor. We know that from the cartouche designation of who was who, and beneath there's another inscription. Now, until I came along, and I don't want to claim any incredible honour for finding this, but people had not even noticed this inscription, and that's not surprising because the inscription is 3,200 plus years old. It's faded and weathered. It's not easy to see unless the sunlight is catching it at a certain angle, and maybe I was fortuitous and I could see pretty clearly that this inscription underneath, which has been taken to be hieroglyphics because the reliefs above are certainly Egyptians, but this inscription here was not hieroglyphics, but an early form of proto-Hebrew. Now the enormous significance of that is that the Hebrews who were here must have made that inscription. They must have done that. They see this Egyptian relief and say, well, we've got to put our name under this because to show that we were here. And they put it in a rectangle, which is uncharacteristic of Egyptian writing. And the letters are not Egyptian hieroglyphics. If you look at the evolution of the Hebrew language, it comes out of Egyptian, there's no question about that. But it's a different form from hieroglyphics, and it's an evolved form of proto-Hebrew, Sinaitic Canaanite, not Canaan, Sinaitic Hebrew. And I was astounded when I saw this, and I thought, well, am I right? So I had to get some confirmation. I went to a chap called Colless, who is at Massey University in New Zealand. He is the world authority on Sinaitic inscriptions. He has a website called Cryptologist. And he said, send me a copy of it. I had some correspondence with him before, and I sent it to him. And he said, this is amazing. It's definitely not Egyptian hieroglyphics. And I said, well, what is it? He said, it's Proto-Sinaitic. It's an early form of Hebrew. And I said, well, what does it say? I was jumping up and down when he sort of teased me with this response. And he said, let me study it, because it's not that easy. Let me study what it says. And he came back with a translation which so fits what we've been talking about, the ancestry of the possibility of Moses taking up the ideas of Akhenaton. And this inscription reinforces that likelihood that the Israelites who were there, and that Moses, who instructed this inscription, had the knowledge and connection. The full translation, or what Colless made of it, is in the book, if you have a look and are more curious to know. So it makes sense in the setting enormously. There's a close-up of that inscription, which is not hieroglyphics. It's got letters which are clearly even reminiscent of modern square form Hebrew. No way is it hieroglyphics. And why had Benno Rothenberg not noticed this? It's very odd. He actually missed this inscription, probably for the reasons that I said. Unless the sunlight is exactly where it gives you an angle on the writing, the incised writing, you don't see most of it. And the people who looked up the official guidebook of Timna Park calls it Egyptian hieroglyphics and gives the most absurd meaning to it. Something about a butler who's bringing wine to people, which is, what's a butler doing in the middle of a mine? Quite wrong. It's not hieroglyphics anyway. It's Proto-Sinaitic Hebrew. This is my reconstruction of the tabernacle that we know about in the Bible, the Exodus, in the Hebrew Bible. We know the dimensions of this tabernacle. We know the descriptions in great detail. Exodus spends most of its time describing the construction and design of a tent that is over the shrine that Moses is supposed to have built at the foot of the mountain. And here it is. Why is there a tent here in the first place? What happened? And Benno Rothenberg's excavations spell this out very clearly. The Midianites, when they took over an empty altar area that the Egyptians had been worshipping Hathor, they put up a tent. That was their custom, to have a tented shrine for their copper snake. They put up a tent. When they go, when the Israelites arrive, the Israelites take over that tent, and that becomes the basis of the biblical tabernacle, the place where the Ark of the Covenant is housed. And this is where it becomes, I would say, almost miraculous. Not only is this place still in part of Israel, and that's a miracle in itself, because most of Sinai is now under the control of Egypt, but some of this tent, some of the fabric of this tent is still with us. Still something you can touch and see. The most holy, holy shrine, certainly in biblical times, is still with us to this day. Benno Rothenberg, in his excavations, found large folds of linen flax piled up behind the shrine. Part of the original tabernacle that Moses is supposed to have been instructed to build. And I think what happens is that they take over this Midianite tent and they embellish it, and they decorate it and they enlarge it, but it's still the basic same format. And the Bible says that the tent is made of red and yellow, fine linen flax. And that's exactly what Benno found at this shrine. This cannot be just a sheer coincidence. This is a convergence. This is proof almost 100% that the Bible knew about what was going on. The memory was still with them. And you'd think it would be. If this is the most holy, holy place, they would have remembered it, and they did. We go across now to Amarna, to the great temple at Akhenaton, on the banks. It was destroyed within 20 years of his death, completely flattened. But the great temple outline is still there. And the Dead Sea Scrolls describe this temple in almost incredible detail. So the circle is complete. The Qumran Essenes, writing the Dead Sea Scrolls, writing the Temple Scroll, and the so-called New Jerusalem Scroll, describe the geographical dimensions and layout of Akhenaton's holy city. And most of it is still there today. And the measurements are confirmed on the ground at Amarna. So that knowledge is brought out with the Hebrews. After Akhenaton is killed, they go underground, Moses takes them up as his people, and they come out with memories of the original holy city that Akhenaton had built. We may not have time, Lorna. Will we have time?
You've got a couple of minutes.
Couple of minutes.
You started a bit.
I want to have time for some. So, there are many other actual hard tangents that point to the truth of what I'm saying, the validity of it. This is one of them. Only one of them. There are dozens more. This is a fresco recently deciphered by Davidovich. It's called the Amenophis fresco. It's dated to about 14th century. And it describes, this is the hieroglyphic translation. He received ornaments of gold and all varieties of precious metal. He dressed him in linen of the finest quality. A collar of pure gold and all sorts of material was placed around his neck. At the age of 30, the great royal scribe bowed before his majesty. This is a paraphrase of the story in the Bible of Joseph, Akhenaton's vizier, his second in command, being ennobled and rewarded with gold collars around his neck. And this dates from the 14th century. This is contemporary with Joseph. So there was a record of his existence. Joseph was a real person, as was Jacob, I'm sure. And the Hebrew Bible, in Genesis chapter 41, verses 42 to 46, paraphrases this Egyptian hieroglyphic. That the story is handed down from generation to generation, comes to us through the Holy Bible. It even crops up in the Quran, similar kind of attaching the king to his person, an established and trusted person, and that's almost certainly referring to Joseph as well. This is incredible too. This is a scene from one of the tomb walls at Amarna. Although that area you saw was a complete, barren, vast 25-acre site now, almost desolate. In a line of hills at the back are tombs where prepared for the courtiers, and another tomb further down prepared for Akhenaton and Nefertiti. And they are still very much intact. And inside this particular tomb, Merira, who is his high priest, there is an image of what I think must have been almost perhaps the Ark of the Covenant. If you look at the descriptions in the Bible, it fills it ticks all the boxes. And the carrying chest in Tutankhamun's tomb is also clearly a prototype, maybe even example of the Ark of the Covenant, with poles that go in to carry. And the Bible describes that in detail. And these poles cannot be removed, just as they cannot be removed in the real examples in Tutankhamun's tomb, which are in the Cairo Museum. Okay, yes?
Go back. The whole thing could be a skull. You've got, sorry, it's just struck me.
Middle green thing.
Yeah. It reminds me of the famous one.
Another David insight.
Yeah, well, there's a famous drawing of a skull based around two little girls in dresses. There would be the nose, there, the eye sockets, and these would be the teeth. It's stretching it a little bit, and obviously top of the head there. Just possibly. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. That's just something.
No, I think the origins of these stories we have some reality in them, and it's a matter of interpreting them correctly. A lot of people look at these things and don't make the right interpretation. They dismiss it too readily. That could well be a possibility, but I think this is possibly an exemplar for the Ark of the Covenant. In my book I describe it in detail. I describe something that is probably almost kept in the Ark of the Covenant, which is still with us today. Another incredible artifact that's survived. The copper scroll story that I told you about, how that took us to Egypt initially, is described fully in this book. My first book was the copper scroll encoded, and this was an enlarged version of it with more and more detail. And this is the book that I really put down in print, on paper, what I've been talking to you about today, but in much, much more detail, with a lot more illustrations, mainly colour illustrations, fully referenced, with all the appendices that go to back up what I've been saying, which I think has demonstrated the true or almost accurate route of the Exodus from Egypt through Sinai into the Promised Land, and the mountain that Moses received the Ten Commandments from. Thank you.
Thank you. If you've got any questions, please ask, for we have that tea that is very nicely prepared for everybody. Any questions?
I just wanted to say that...
Yes, so what's your name?
Eve. I've just been on a trip where Stephen Meller has worked extensively in Egypt, and he's written a book, and he also believes that Akhenaton was an ascended master, and his works led to the beginning of religion.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that.
He refers to him as being influential in the Hebrews and the Jews, that sort of thing.
Okay, well, I'm pleased to hear that. Another support for my theory.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
I want to talk, I was very interested, I've always been interested in Hathor, and I've even got, I showed it to Veronica, a picture of Hathor on my phone. And one of the things was, Lawrence Gardner, I don't know whether you're familiar with that stuff, he said that the temple of Hathor was at Mount Horeb?
That is one of the suggestions.
And what they found when they went to the temple was they pulled back flagstones, and underneath the flagstones was a lot of white powder. And what was the fate of that golden calf when Moses took it up? He brought down bread for the people, didn't he? He had it converted. And it's this thing about mufkuts, which is monotonic gold, which was so important in Lawrence Gardner's thinking of things. And the Temple of Hathor is all linked around with this monotonic gold, and the conversion of gold, the gold idol, into something else which was white and bread-like that Moses gave to his people having come down the mountain.
I'm intrigued by this, and there's a lot of mixed messages in there. I mean, is the ringtone on your phone a moo?
No, it's not.
No. Okay, I know what you're talking about. The biblical story is that when Moses comes down the mountain, he sees the golden calf being worshipped, which Aaron has built for the people. And he has it destroyed, and he has it ground into powder and spread on water, and makes the people drink it as a punishment. It's just an implausible action. And Lawrence Gardner's Nefusc, or whatever it is, monatomic atom gold, I find very difficult to cope with.
Well, he had some when he talked to us
he did.
sometime. He showed it to us.
What is monatomic gold?
It's gold where they put a spin on the electrons in gold, and it turns it from the metal into a powder. Now, the reason for this mufkutz was very important, because I don't know whether you're familiar with the idea of the Vestal Virgins in a temple.
Yes.
Their job was to supply menstrual blood, and the Pharaoh used to imbibe this blood, and it had certain things in it which gave you more the ability to see and get in touch with the gods. But they discovered that mufkutz does exactly the same thing. It wakes up centres of the brain which actually make you more able to communicate with and to bring mark to the people by communicating with the god.
I'm not unsympathetic to these kind of interpretations, and it's a possibility. My understanding was that this mufkutz, or whatever it is a mistranslation of turquoise from the hieroglyphics. Because that mountain, the other mine that we talked about, was a turquoise mine. And that was the term they used there for turquoise. But nevertheless, he may be right. I don't know.
Well, you might know about the triangles when they're depicted.
Yes.
On
like cones.
Yeah, little cones.
Yes.
That Gardner reckons that that's a depiction of shoe bread, which is made from monatomic gold.
Okay.
Yeah, and it gives you enlightenment in a way.
And it would certainly make you not want food or drink,
Okay.
because you'd be aware of not wanting it.
The manner that they're fed is very difficult to understand what that's about. Any other? Yes.
Was Tutankhamun's father?
Was Akhenaton Tutankhamun's father? Some people think, I don't think he was. No, but it's a possibility. There is a theory. There's an intermediate pharaoh between Akhenaton and Tutankhamun, Menkauhara, but I don't think Tutankhamun. But Tutankhamun follows the religion of his father, because his throne chair initially is Tutankhamun, not Tutankhamun. Yes, on the back of the throne of Tutankhamun's throne chair, there is an image of him as Tutankhaten. So he probably was closer to his father, or whoever was his father, or the religion of his father, than later when they forced him to turn to Amun as the god, and becomes Tutankhamun, the pagan god. Yeah.
Well, one of the quick questions.
Yes, sure.
As Moses traipsed across going to the fight, there was an awful lot of smiting went on. It seems to be quite a feature where they destroyed whole communities, not leaving an animal or anything alive as they went through. And then we see the destruction of the temple and the defacing of the face of Hathor and being chucked over the back. Isn't this an awful lot like the Islamists are doing in the museums in Iraq?
What the Islamists are doing?
We're looking at that in a little bit more of a sour way than we did with Moses with all his smiting.
It's true, and what the Islamists are doing is disgraceful and disgusting. But I think we have to be very careful about literally taking descriptions in the Bible, and I only take them as a guide and a hint. And the destruction of the Midianites may be a great exaggeration, and certainly in my reading of the 10 plagues, which are pretty horrific, particularly the killing of the firstborn, I don't think any of that happened. You can discount that completely. The 10 plagues are a demonstration by the biblical writers later on of the power of God to defeat the most powerful king in the known world, the Pharaoh, and to bring him to his knees. And it's done by replicating a story that's in the Ipuwer papyrus, well known in Egypt, of plagues and disasters that struck Egypt because of probably the eruption of Santorini in about 1630 BC. And that's chronicled in the Ipuwer. And all the plagues that you see in the Bible are in the Ipuwer papyrus. And they extracted 10 of the most desirable and juicy ones to demonstrate the power of God in defeating and letting the people come out. And even the killing of the firstborn is reprised, or it's the other way around, they reprise the Ipuwer papyrus story of the children of the throat, which is babies being carried by the nurse, being dashed against the wall. That is the killing of the firstborn, just extracted from a real event in Egyptian history and made into a useful mechanism to demonstrate another objective. There is blood, that doesn't mean there weren't a lot of bloodthirsty actions by the Israelites, there were.
No, the interesting part is, if you believe yours is the true God, that gives you carte blanche to do anything you want to everybody else's.
Does appear to be the case. Yes.
Okay, everybody. Thank you again. Thank you again.